Welcome back to my channel. This one is going to be Fruit of Passion number 4. And in Fruit of Passion number 4, we're going to make the clear distinction between the thinking that people have that want a free and just society as opposed to the thinking of people that want a slave society. Now, Moses was raised in the Pharaoh's palace in Egypt, and his upbringing teaches him that a slave society keeps order in the community. So when Moses decided to build his community out of the herdsmen and that were in the city of Avaris on the Delta Nile, he had to choose from the people that were there that were willing to be part of his community. So he moved in with the opportunity of having the Hebrews that were living in Egypt and around Egypt and in the city of Avaris as well to join him. And primarily these are the ones that were called the Levites. The others were names that were picked up and probably were created as a result of the people that chose to join. Moses and the Israelites will not agree with the thinking that the Philistines have. The Philistines' thinking about having a free and just society is a different way of thinking about society that people that have a slave community engages in. With a slave community, you have to have strong leaders, and the strong leaders is what brings the community to a position where there is consistency, people are obeying the rules, and there is community working together to accomplish certain purposes. Difference in thinking between the free society is that in a free society, the people try to work out the differences, try to have an agreement on what will work for everyone. And so there's a lot of negotiation that needs to go on, but there is no conflict and any fighting. In a slave society, as I said before, the ultimate attitude of the horsepower engine is, if it doesn't agree with you, kill it. And that's why I refer to these years as the murder and mayhem years, because of a lot of killing got started then and went on. Now, from the time period we're talking about here with Moses, it will still be another 30 years before the Ramses, the Pharaoh Ramses, goes up and has a fight with the Hittites over the land that is now going to be cemented as belonging to Egypt, and it will be land that the Philistines will ultimately move into. But for now, we're just prior to that time, and we're trying to get adjusted to the devastation of the Philistines that have now been wiped off the face of the earth for at least 150 years. The Egyptians and the Assyrians immediately started trading between the two communities. They tried to keep as much of the trading empire alive as they possibly could. Now, what that did is it slowed down the deterioration of the trading community between those two countries. But every place else, it had started as a destruction situation as soon as a volcano went off. Within a 24-hour period, the Philistines were no longer in the business of trading throughout the area that they had traded in before, which was from India in the south up to the Scandinavian countries in the north, all the way out to the British Isles in the west, and they were starting to trade with the people all the way what eventually would become known as the Silk Road to the east. That they ruled the southern part of Egypt. That is not true. They were traders. They were free people. They never put anyone as a second class citizen. They were a free society. They were only interested in trading. Did they trade with the southern part of Egypt? Yes, they did. And what did they do with that trading? Well, they probably got the profit for themselves. That's why one of the pharaohs, after Habashat, went out and said he conquered them. No, he didn't conquer them. They were a group of people that worked out all disagreements with everyone. They never had any battles. They worked out an agreement where they would start paying what we would call as property taxes or tribute, whatever you wanted to call it. It's existed for the last 4,000 years. It existed then. It had still got its head reared up now, and we pay a lot of money in property taxes. Well, they paid money because it was Egypt now that was helping to protect them from invaders. Now, we do know that during this time, they had a very successful community and they didn't have any invaders, so they didn't have to have a standing army. The standing armies came in place when the Ramses took over. When the Ramses took over, things had deteriorated enough, they needed a standing army. The Midian territory, raising a family, is when Akhenaten's father took over the territory up in the area that the Philistines would be placed in. And it would be the Ramses trying to defend that area that actually allowed the Philistines to move there from the city of Avaris. So now we all know the chronology follows and it makes sense. It's not rocket science. All you have to do is look at some facts on the ground. You can look at the archaeology of what happened. And one of the things that I even saw this morning even said that some of the people in the high coast area were Philistines. Right now, I am going to move on about my story along what happened in the Bible, because we have the 5 books of Moses. We pretty much covered everything. The boy with the coat of many colors, and Joseph was a story that Moses knew from his education in Egypt. So he blended the story when he wrote a history to give the Israelites a history. Now, Moses, did he have to give a history? Well, if you believe what I'm telling you, you know he had to, because I'm saying we're talking about an area of in the mid 1300 BC. That would be around 1350 to 1355 BC, that Moses would have been in Midian and being, as I told you before, the first calling that God told me, I don't want you to be a preacher or a teacher. And I did not listen for 10 years. Moses probably wasn't any quicker than I was. I take that back. He probably was. Moses was very smart. He was probably one of the higher IQ people, but he had some of my characteristics as well. He could figure out a few things. So he had to blend the story of Adam and Eve and the story of this founding fathers. And why do I say that? Because when we look at what we know, we have to go all the way to 1209 BC. Now that's probably another 40 years at least, 20 to 40 years after the Israelites took over the territory that I'm saying they took over. And why do I mention that? Because in history, that's the first time that an Egyptian pharaoh bragged that he got rid of the Israelites. Now, am I saying that he engaged Moses's people? Not necessarily. You have to remember everyone embellished at that time. One of two things could have happened. Number one is it could have been a prior group of people that called themselves Israelis, and it could be the Pharaoh completely annihilated them, because a lot of communities then were city states. They were not countries as we know now that included multiple cities. We're just getting started into that, knowing the Philistines had 5 cities. They did not form a unified government. They were all individual cities, all independent from each other, and all treated each other as equals. So that was an unusual situation that has not duplicated itself since they were driven out of those cities by the Babylonians. And they joined up then with the Phoenicians and became part of the Phoenician society. But back at that time, we had basically city states. So there could have been a group of people called Israelis. Why do I say that? Because Jacob's name wasn't Israel. He was named Jacob according to Moses. It was only after he wrestled with God that he was changed his name to Israel. Now, why do I mention that? Because this is the type of thing that people would have done. If Moses was aware that a group of people had existed that got wiped off the face of the earth and none of them existed anymore, and he called his people Israeli, people would think they went all the way back to the beginning of the nation state that he was copying the name from. That way it gives them a longer history going back. Now, why do I say that's likely? Because we know that Moses knew when he started talking about Abraham, he was making something up that happened several hundred years before he was ever born. So he has to make it fit so they believe it. Now, is it hard to believe that he could make people to know that? And the answer is, if you say yes, you haven't listened to anything I've ever told you, because people are still using the word Minoan. So when people don't know, they stick with what they don't know. Their horsepower engine won't let them put it over. So Moses would have used that because he was just as intelligent and just as savvy as we are. So if we start giving these people the credit for the intelligence they had, we can probably find more truth out faster than believing a good majority of things that are written that we know while we're reading it that they're embellishing. And how much do we know that? Well, remember the name Akhenaten? If it weren't for, as I said, God's sense of humor. And why do I say God's sense of humor? Because what we know today is that probably the pharaoh that took over after I, which was a commoner, he wasn't even in the royal line, but he took over. He definitely knew he was in a slave society, and his horsepower engine wanted him in a position where he could take over. I've seen some writings that he was offended that I took over when Tutankhamun died, because he thought he should have been the pharaoh after. That shows they have a slave society with the slave mentality. That's why I think he had something to do with Akhenaten's disappearance and death. But since we don't know, we may never know that. If someone's smart enough to track it down and find out what he was doing, he probably stabbed Akhenaten in the back because he's not even as honorable as Brutus, who Julius Caesar said, et tu, Brute. In other words, Brutus was stabbing him along with the rest. Now we go forward to Julius Caesar. He had a slave mentality as well, and he was going to take over the Roman Empire, and he was going to be the king and the leader. But they did continue having a king, and the Senate no longer was the absolute ruler. The leader of the Romans took over then. But the reason I mention that is that this Saul was not as brave as Brutus. Now, Brutus did have other people helping him, and this Saul that was a pharaoh with his horsepower engine snuck up behind Akhenaten and stabbed him in the back. And that's probably how he died, because he thought when he killed Akhenaten, he deserved to be the pharaoh. Now, that being said, it's the same attitude that people have when they continue saying things that are not true, that logically should be looked at by them and change their thinking. And some of the things I'm telling you, when you look at and you investigate, you might find out they are absolutely true, and they will help us to know truth from fiction. And that is my goal, because if we duplicate what people did, I think we will have the same results. And that isn't because of my belief in God. That's because of my belief in chemistry. If you mix the same chemicals each time, you get the same result. Now, how do I know that there are things like that? Well, I happen to be living at a time when the atom bomb was invented. And the movie Oppenheimer is coming out soon. There's going to be a lot of bolstering in that movie as well. There's going to be a lot of truth said. And I doubt that anyone looking at that movie can even get 50% of the truth and the fiction separated and know the difference. So this is not an easy task, and there's nothing to guarantee I'm right, but it's going to take each of you the time to do it. This is the beginning of the distinction between the free society and slave societies. The Philistines lived for 8,000 years, and they were a free society during the entire 8,000 years. Now, was everyone around them a free society? No, some city-states had people that were trying to take over because they had a slave mentality. When you have people coming out of the hills that are hunters and gatherers, and they're only coming down to the farmers to steal what they have, are people with a slave society as well. They're hunters and gatherers that no longer can support themselves because the game is not plentiful enough to keep them alive. And there's two things they know about farmers. The farmers always have food and they never move. So they always know where to go and they always know there's stuff to steal. That's why farmers started getting picked on. Now, do I know there's a difference between the two? Yes, because one of my favorite people of the world's history, Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus, in my opinion, is a great because he's from a slave society, but he recognizes free societies are better. So he did everything he could in his ruling of the Persian Empire to make it as free as he possibly knew how to do without losing control. Because as we know from that stuck Akhenaten in the back with the blade and killed him so he could take over as Pharaoh, there are those kind of people. So if you turn your back on one of them, you're liable to get a knife in the back. So they have to watch what they're doing. Now, unfortunately for Cyrus the Great, he misunderstood that when he went up to fight the people, that her son was the general. When he took the wine up and then retreated and went back after all the soldiers got drunk and then took him as a prisoner, he did not know and he did not warn the guards, make sure he doesn't kill himself. And the war that was precipitated as a result of that gentleman committing suicide was an injury that Cyrus the Great received, and everyone agrees that's what caused him his life. He had ruled for at least 40 years. He was getting to be an older man. I think he deserved to have a quiet death, but it was not to be. As I said, God does have a sense of humor. Cyrus the Great was the first great man that I've ever heard of. The people that call Alexander the Great are nothing but Minoan mouths. Minoan mouth people, as your horsepower engine is run amok and you haven't segregated truth from fiction. It's time to get on with it and start segregating because of the miscalculation between Cyrus and the gentleman, the general of the army, killing himself. His mother got an army of what was left. Now, the Amazon people still existed. 100% of the Amazon people were not part of the Philistines. Part of the Philistine group were Amazon women and Romanian type men. And I use the name Romanian because those names came a lot later. Because back at that time, it wasn't called Greece. Not until the Roman Empire started did Rome start referring to it as Greece. They were all city-states, and they were some city-states that were freer than others. We know that because they had Sparta and Athens thought they were free. We know that wasn't true because what happened to Socrates. So we know that there's been a mixture between slave societies and the want to have a free society, and that's true with what I'm talking about here. I'm going to try to differentiate between what's left over from the free societies and those that have a slave society. Into the fruit of passion, number 4. And as I had asked you throughout the presentation, please try to spread the word. So thank you for coming. I'm going to conclude now the fruit of passion number 4.